Hello and welcome to Speak Up, Listen Up, Follow Up, the podcast from the National Guardian's office. Throughout October's Speak Up month, the National Guardian for the NHS, Dr. Jayne Chidgey-Clark, will be in conversation with leaders Speak Up for everyone, and she'll be exploring the impact speaking up can bring to safety, civility and inclusion. In our second episode, Jayne speaks to Dr. Chris Turner, the co-founder of Civility Saves Lives, about Week 2's theme, Speaking Up for Civility.
We rush to judgment when actually we should be taking curiosity into these conversations, working out what was going on for the other person.
We hope you enjoy this episode, and now over to Jayne.
Well, good morning, Chris. It's absolutely a privilege to have you here today on the podcast in this really important month of October, where we're highlighting the importance of speaking up. And this particular week, our focus is on civility, and who better to be sharing the podcast with than yourself, with all the work that you've been doing on Civility Saves Lives. But before we talk about that, can I just ask you, what does freedom to speak up mean to you?
Do you know what? I wasn't expecting you to say that. It's lovely to be here, Jade. And what does freedom to speak up mean to me? Freedom to speak up and the freedom to speak up guardians are like a dirty great door into understanding what people are thinking within the NHS. The freedom to speak up guardians got the key for, unlocked and started to open. And then people have been able to see this as a way of talking about what's happening at work, often about some of the bad stuff, but not just about the bad stuff, about the good stuff as well. It's a way that people have felt entitled to give an opinion, to raise concerns. And you know, on some levels, people always say it's a shame that we have to have people talking about civility. I suppose it's a shame that we had to have freedom to speak up guardians, but it doesn't stop it being a good thing. And I've been massively impressed by the change in the about getting people's opinions within the NHS since the freedom to speak up guardians have been instituted. And I suppose did it come about through Francis?
That's right.
Yeah. So I suppose I've been intimately involved with Freedom to Speak Up Guardians then since their inception. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, you know, for me, that freedom to speak up, and you touched on it, it's workers being able to speak up about anything that gets in the way of them doing their job, not just the really important patient safety issues, but actually there's that's safety issues, but actually that's was one of the fundamental reasons why Sir Robert Francis suggested that we have the freedom to speak up guardian role as that valuable alternative route, because people, you know, were not able to use the existing routes for whatever reason. So route, and I very much see it as an additional route to all those other routes, like your line manager, like your patient safety teams, like your HR, etc. So I think having that additional route, and I love that analogy of opening the door to finding out more about what's going on within an organisation. So thank you for starting off with Civility Saving Lives and your organisation, the movement that you've been very much key part of. Can you just tell our listeners, from your perspective, how does Civility save lives?
Well, there's a big question. So bottom line to this is that civility is one of the fundamentals of how we treat each other. We treat each other in a civil way or an uncivil way. Almost everything that we do at work involves other people. Very few of us work in isolation. So we're constantly interactions with people. And how we interact with other people determines how well we will perform, but also how well they will perform. And that has an impact on the quality of care that patients get in healthcare, but actually the quality of projects that people do outside healthcare, patient-facing part of it. So we didn't know about this, but what we now know is that civility has an impact on a personal level, so that the recipient the victim or recipient of incivility, that has an impact on their ability to think. It compresses their bandwidth, stops them being able to come up with that great answer. We know that within teams that incivility stops people sharing information, and we know that within teams that sharing information is the key factor determining how well the team performs in the sorts of decisions that they make. Because if you don't know about something, how can you take it into account when you're making a decision? And we know that organisations that are more civil have better staff satisfaction, better staff engagement, increased staff retention, and increased trust in management and rates. And really, we know this stuff now, but we didn't 25 years ago. Nobody knew about this 25 years ago. It was utterly fringe. And it's become more and more of a thing. So we're now aware of it. And I mean, the purpose of Civility Saves Lives is really just anybody how to behave. I'm very clear that we don't tell people how to behave. We let people know the impact of behaviour, and then that's their choice. And I'm not standing preaching to anybody. I'm just saying this is the data that's out there. So that's kind of the impact that civility, incivility has on performance, and it is utterly fundamental. Some things, we can make a system better by putting a new process in place, but what we're talking about here is every interaction, every day with other people. Management techniques that we might use in other situations don't really work. This has to be something that we choose to take on board for ourselves and choose to role model in as fulsome a way as we can do if we believe in it.
That is so helpful, Chris, because I think having that understanding, that mirror held up to the impact and the evidence base behind the impact of civility or incivility on performance, on safety in the NHS, and obviously much wider, is so key and so important. Our recent data from Freedom to Speak Up Guardians, who regularly submit anonymised cases to us so that we can look at what's happening across the country, for the first 3 months this year, shows that approximately a third of the cases, so 31%, included an element of inappropriate behaviours, bullying and harassment. That's a separate category. So a third of cases that Freedom to Speak Up Guardians were having brought to them were having elements of inappropriate behaviours and attitudes. And I just wondered, from your experience again, what might those behaviours, what might that look like? What are those elements that make up the incivility that gets of good performance and potential patient safety?
So I would see this as a continuum, and I think that, at one end there's these mildly uncivil behaviours, and at the other end there's bullying and harassment. And one of the ways I would see this, and I will answer your question more specifically in a second, but one of the ways I see this is that allowing uncivil behaviours to flourish in our workplaces is like a gateway to bullying and harassment, because there tends to be this kind of creep of behaviour, and people's behaviours get worse and worse. Now, at the incivility end of the spectrum, the uncivil behaviours, the sorts of things that people sometimes talk about are someone who tuts when you speak, who rolls their eyes for you, somebody who corrects your English, people who wander into a room and don't introduce themselves because they believe that they're too important and they shouldn't have to introduce themselves. That's actually our interpretation of that. It may well be that somebody walks into a room and doesn't introduce themselves because they're really anxious, and they do that, and that's one of the issues around this end of the spectrum. It actually happens at the bullying and harassment end of the spectrum as well, but that we tend to think that people are deliberately behaving in a certain way in order to make us feel a certain way. And the evidence on this is that that's rarely the case. That actually people, if I'm in a conversation with you, Jayne, and I do something that you feel is uncivil, you will probably think I've deliberately done that, I probably have no idea.
Yeah, it's that unconsciousness of it, isn't it?
Absolutely. And if you then don't tell me about it, if you then don't say, Chris, really, did you roll your eyes at me? If you don't tell me about it, I might not recognise that that's happened. That then just becomes part and parcel of me. It becomes normalised within the culture that that can feel disdainful, and then behaviours creep from there. So the sorts of behaviours I'm talking about are that sort of mild to moderate end of the spectrum. One of the things that's quite important about them is they're open to interpretation. That being said, that when we interpret them, we're pretty convinced we're right. We are convinced that this person was trying to offend us. And sometimes when you step back and look at it from a bit further away, you go, hang on a second, that's maybe not what was going on. I saw a lovely example of this a couple of days ago. I was watching a film with my wife. The film is called The Right Stuff, and it's about astronauts. I like space. I like astronauts. I like the space race. And in this film, John Glenn, who was one of the original astronauts, the first guy to go around the world, John Glenn's wife comes into a room, and it's the first time she's met the other wives of the astronauts. And she comes in the room, and one of the wives says, "Hi, how you doing?" She's really nice to her. John Glenn's wife looks at her, holds her eye contact, and then looks away. Holds her eye contact, and then looks away and walks away. And she leaves the room, and they go, "Wow, isn't she snobby?" Then 10, 15 minutes later in the film, you see John Glenn and his wife in the house talking to each other. Well, he's talking to her, and she has a stammer, and her stammer is so profound that even when it's just him and her, she's going before she can speak. And the interpretation of the people in the room was that she was not speaking because she was being standoffish. That the reality was that she just didn't feel able to speak in that environment, and felt humiliated by her stammer. And it made me stop and pause and think, how many of these uncivil interactions do we have? Because we tend to lean into judgment. Somebody behaves a certain way, we lean into judgment. We make an assumption about the character of that person. We decide that they've deliberately treated us badly, therefore they're a bad person. And actually, one of the things I've learned over years and years and years of this, because it started off for me when I used to read the datexes coming in, when I worked in mid-staffs, reading the datexes coming in about how badly one person had treated another. I used to be raging. Some people write a brilliant datex, by the way. They write an absolutely amazing datex that plucks at your heartstrings and gets the blood boiling. And I'd go out there and I'd be ready to get the claymore out and just scythe them down. And then you speak to them, and you find out about their perspective, and you discover it's completely different. And the sort of meta message that I've come to around this is that we rush to judgment when actually we should be taking curiosity into these conversations, working out what was going on for the other person. And I think I've got...
And Chris, I'd add to that.
Rambling.
No, not at all. That's so helpful. And I think what I'm struck by is that challenge to myself, and I hope to our listeners, to be more self-aware, both self-aware of how our behaviours may come across to others, and because as human beings we put it is almost too easy to put judgment on, oh well, they did that because, and so the challenge to me is just that reflection on how I might be coming across. And then also, if someone's coming, I think, oh, that was a bit of a response that made me sit back in my chair, like it does sometimes, is that rather than internalizing it and doing a mind read of what that person means by that behavior, is actually having the curiosity to maybe say in a really spirit of curiosity, that's left me feeling this. What how does it feel for you? What's going on for you? And actually having a conversation about it. And I guess that's one of the things I'm sort of thinking about. But how do you think, given what we know, what the research tells us, what your experience and our experience tells us, how can we ensure better civility as the bedrock of them?
Okay. I love the idea that we are very poor mind readers, by the way. I'm going to take that on board, and that will be appearing in a talk sometime soon. And I will attempt to remember to credit you with it, Jane. How do we improve civility? How do we improve behaviour? Civility. How do we improve behaviours in the workplace? Well, the first and most important thing probably is that you can't expect people to behave in certain ways towards each other unless they feel that it has value within their life, and it's important within their values. Now, for an awful lot of people, it's nice to be nice. But if you speak to other people, they're not really interested in niceness if it doesn't result in better outcomes, say, for patients. So the argument can't be about it's nice to be nice and we should all be lovely to each other. For some people, the argument is when we treat each other poorly, poorer outcomes. And how we treat each other is going to help to determine that. If I'm talking to executive teams, I show them the financial evidence around what happens when you have an organisation that sits at the top end of the civility scale, because they really care about finances, because their jobs depend on it. It's not because they're just money obsessed. It's so the starting place for me, if we want people to choose to behave in certain ways, is make it valuable for them, make it resonate with their own personal values. And don't expect that telling people that, hey, we're a respectful organisation and you must obey trust values is going to result in people doing that, because it simply doesn't. In fact, it induces what's called reactance, which is a psychological phenomenon when people go, you're telling me how to behave. You are telling me how to behave. You're taking control of me. Well, watch me. And then they act out and they push back, and they might be more uncivil in that setting. So just push back and they might be more uncivil in that setting. So just laying it out there for people, laying it out there, letting them see what the evidence is, and letting them choose for themselves who they want to be when they walk in the door to work. And that is an incredibly powerful way of getting change within a system, people what to do.
That's a real strong key message, Chris, and I really appreciate that. And I think you used the words earlier on in our conversation about the importance of role modelling the behaviours that we seek to experience. We need to be the role models of what we. Thank you. We're reaching the end of our time, and I know we could talk for a lot longer, but I just wondered if, as a closing thought, you might like to give our listeners and myself your Speak Up pledge for this October.
Hey, so my Speak Up pledge is actually to keep talking about what I talk about. My pledge is to keep doing my best to let people know about the impact of behaviour on performance, but also to keep trying my best to present the best version of myself on a daily basis at work, with a caveat. We all get it wrong sometimes. Sometimes we get it wrong in a way that there can be no doubt that we got it wrong. Sometimes we get it wrong for people in a way that we don't understand and we can't see. We don't know how we caused them offence, because there was, it wasn't clear within us. We knew what our intent was. And we need to be compassionate to ourselves when that happens. We have been rude to other people, or whether other people have interpreted us in that way. But we also need to go and try to fix it afterwards. It's not enough just to be compassionate to yourself. It's important that we try and recognise the feelings of others and do something about that. So my pledge is to keep on talking about this. My pledge is to try and be the best version of myself, and to be compassionate towards myself when I get it wrong, but also to be compassionate towards others when they get it wrong, because none of us are perfect.
Thank you, Chris. It's been an absolute delight to talk to you today, and
it's lovely to see you.
Look forward to catching up again soon.
Thank you so much, Chris, for taking the time to come on our podcast. Thank you for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Next time, Jayne will be joined by the Chair of the NHS Confederation, Lord Victor Abaduwale, to discuss Week 3's theme, Speak Up for Inclusion. Make sure so you never miss an episode. We welcome your feedback, so please like, rate and comment. Thank you for listening.